Everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We are very excited to welcome Alyssa Cole to do an author talk with us today. My name is Katie Peace. I am the Director of Communications for the Preservation League of New York State. If you're not familiar with us, Preservation League empowers all New Yorkers to use historic preservation to enrich their communities, protect their heritage, and build a sustainable future. The League does this work in every corner of New York State, and we do it in lots of different ways. We provide grants that jumpstart preservation projects. We advocate for preservation at the local, state, and national level. We provide technical assistance, collaborate with local colleagues across the state, award excellence in historic preservation. We draw attention to at-risk historic sites, and we offer engaging virtual programs like this one. And I do want to thank our sponsors for this, the Peggy and Roger G. Gary Charitable Trust. And since we are a nonprofit, our members also make this kind of work possible. So thank you to all of you. And I'm very excited that we are collaborating with Black and Historic Preservation to co-host today's event. Black and Historic Preservation is a program of Workshop Kilowatt, a design studio that specializes in historic preservation and owners representation, founded by architect K. Kennedy Widers, AIA. And we're really excited that Kennedy is joining us to moderate the conversation with Alyssa following her presentation. A little bit about Kennedy. She's an architect, published writer, social scientist, guest speaker, and an entrepreneur who's a national leader in the power of healing through storytelling about historical trauma. Her workshop, Kilowatt, is home to 3 initiatives that support racial equity and historic preservation, architecture, and history communications. In addition to Black and Historic Preservation, she also runs Unredact the Facts and Beyond Integrity in X. And now the reason that we are here today to talk about the books When No One Is Watching and One of Us Knows. When No One Is Watching is set in a historic Brooklyn neighborhood where gentrification is a truly ominous force. The book asks the question, where do people go when gentrification pushes them out? One of Us Knows is set at a fictional historic estate on Hudson River Island, years after a breakdown and a diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder derailed her historical preservationist career. Kenetria Nash and her alters have been given a second chance they can't refuse, a position as a resident caretaker of a historic home. Dealing with issues of historical trauma, One of Us Knows forces the reader to consider the sinister histories underlying the places that have traditionally been deemed worthy of preservation. A lot of the Preservation Book Club books we feature are nonfiction, and it's always fun to find fiction that is kind of taking on these issues. So we're very excited to welcome Alyssa Cole to talk about these 2 books. Alyssa is a New York Times and USA Today bestselling author. She writes across and blends genres, including thriller, mystery, suspense, contemporary romance, sci-fi romance, speculative fiction, historical fiction, fantasy romance, and graphic novels. She and her work have been featured in many publications, and she has written many books, not just these 2, but today we're excited that she's going to talk about these 2 in particular for our preservationist audience. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alyssa to tell us about her work and her inspiration, and then she'll be joined by Kennedy after she does that. So thank you all for joining us.
So today we're talking about my 2 thrillers, which are When No One Is Watching and One of Us Knows. And both of these books deal with Black female protagonists who are in modern day New York, one in Brooklyn and one on an island in the Hudson River. And they are both, although they have very different experiences, they are both dealing with things that are tied to the past of the places where they live or where they are currently living. So, When No One Is Watching was my first thriller. And in that book, if you have not read it, it's about a woman who returns to live with her mom in their Brooklyn brownstone after her divorce. And she's going through a lot of things, and her mom is not doing well, but also her neighborhood is being gentrified so rapidly that it's frightening. And then she starts to realize that maybe something else is going on. And one of the things she does to kind of get a sense of control, as everything is changing so quickly around her, is she decides to start a historical tour of her neighborhood, centering the Black people who have lived there. And One of Us Knows, this is a kind of more of a gothic thriller. It's set on an island that is based on Palapel Island or Bannerman's Island, which is up in Hudson River by Fishkill and by Cold Harbor. Uh, I'm probably messing that up. But and this book is kind of more of a, trapped on an island in a storm, and it draws on the real history of Bannerman's Island as it's known, and but with a fictional twist that ties into the heroine's historical preservationist past and also the current creepy goings on the island. And as Katie was saying, I think that usually you have nonfiction writers, so I am excited to be here as a fiction writer. Um, One of the reasons that I enjoy having historical aspects to my books, even if they're modern books, is that I feel that genre fiction, particularly, all fiction is important. I'm not going to do like a hierarchy of like which is most important. But I do think that genre fiction, and I write romance, thriller, sci-fi, a little bit of everything. I think it's really important, and it can serve as a great educational tool. I don't think all books have to do that, but I do think that a lot of people learn from the books that they read, or from the movies they watch or the TV shows they watch. And I think that if you have an interest in history, um, but genre fiction books can be a great way of exploring historical, either real life historical events or real historical places in fictional settings. And people who would maybe have never heard about these things or these places um, will, maybe be interested in and want to learn more. If they don't want to learn more, they'll at least know a little bit about things that they might not have ever, decided to pick up a history textbook or a nonfiction book, since, not everyone reads nonfiction. So I think that thinking of it in the way of historical preservation in the form of literature, I think that there's like many different ways of doing that. There's nonfiction, um, there's, textbooks, and then there's also fiction that kind of draws on these real places and kind of all together create a kind of um, shared pool of knowledge for readers. Um, and because of that, thinking, I'm sure all of you are aware of this if you're in historical preservation, but whether it's historical preservation or being historian or being a writer, any field that preserves and presents histories to others is political by its very nature, like because when you are in these positions, you're basically curating what is important historically, who was important historically, and who you feel is worth telling other people about. And I think that's something that is kind of an undercurrent in both of my thrillers, because one of the reasons I started writing historical fiction to begin with, I'm still a romance writer, but I started only in romance and writing historical romances. And a lot of that was driven by the fact that I felt kind of annoyed that I had not learned so many things about Black American history, which is American history. And like just so many different aspects of history that I kept learning about. And I'm like, these stories are amazing. And I wish I had known about this before. And so I realized that one way I can kind of help share these kinds of stories or even fiction, not every story is based on real people, but stories that get people to rethink where Black people and people of color were during, because I feel like in a lot of American history movies and books and things, it's like slavery and then the civil rights movement and particularly in slavery, Black people are not really shown as having very much agency. So with my works, my historical works, I try to really not, and I'm certainly not the only author doing this, but for me, it was important to show, particularly because I was writing romance where Black representation was and is very uh, there. I won't get into the whole diversity situation, diversity in literature, but as far as historical romance, there were not many publishers willing to publish historical romances that had people of color. So for me, it was important to kind of catalog these eras, the fact that we existed, and romances, were loved and uh, doing things other than what you have been taught in school. Um, and so this does not make me, you know, an activist or anything like that, but I do understand that writing these stories is political, as are the stories that choose to omit all of those things, even if they could be there. So in both of these thrillers, one in the and when no one is watching, Sydney is just like a regular person who has like, a slight interest in history, but is kind of fired up by feeling that she's kind of losing the history of her neighborhood around her and that it's being rewritten by people from outside the neighborhood. And in One of Us Knows, Ken is an artist who is interested in history as well and decides when she is having trouble creating art, she decides to try to get into historical preservation, which she also enjoys. And that doesn't work out for her. And if you've read the book, you know why. But so an undercurrent of that is her being Black and trying to enter this field that uh, historically hasn't been open to, African American women. So that's background for that. And for me, when I'm writing about history, a lot of the time too, I am, and no matter what I write, even if it's lighthearted, I'm usually on some level looking at the power dynamics of the situation. So when I'm writing my thrillers and I'm adding historical elements to them, for me, it's a way of kind of exploring the present day power dynamics using the contrast of the past and the way that, the past isn't even past, as William Faulkner said. So I'll tell you a little about a bit about how I researched the books. So for when no one is watching, I actually lived in Brooklyn for many years and lived in New York and in Jersey City. And so a lot of that was from my own lived experience. I also did some site visits, particularly to the Weeksville Heritage Center, which I'll talk about a bit in a second, because I'm going to highlight for each book a place that I feel is important to the story for me. Historical documents, of course, books, papers, uh, research papers and theses from people studying certain historical time periods or people in those time periods or places, and historical online resources. And some of my biggest online resources were sites for, documenting the historical preservationist aspect of here is this building, and this is when this building was made, and this is who owned the building, and all of these kind of details, including brownstoner. And one of the people who ended up randomly, because I didn't know who they were because they used a different name when they were writing online, um, being very integral to a lot of the things that I learned about was a historian and historical preservationist, Suzanne Spellin. And so who also gave tours in Brooklyn, similar to what my protagonist was doing. So after I found out about her, I reached out to her and interviewed her to ask her about things like historical sites and giving historical tours. And her experience in these things. So all of these things were very super useful for the research elements, and also because I wrote One of Us Knows during COVID and was not really able to travel very much. The online resources, such as museums and places putting their exhibitions online, and a lot of places like really making things more accessible online was really valuable to me, as well as video tours, either on the sites of certain historical places or on YouTube. Um, so yeah. Hey, Suzanne is here. Hi. Yeah, Suzanne is great and was very, unbeknownst to her, very helpful to me um, in the writing of these books, in the research of these books. So, to talk a bit about Brooklyn history and when no one is watching. So, in the books, that, like I said, Sydney decides to create a historical tour of her Bed-Stuy neighborhood, highlighting its Black history to push back against encroaching gentrification. And one of the places she discovers is Weeksville. She goes to the Weeksville Heritage Center. And Weeksville was a historic neighborhood founded by free Black Americans around 1838. The land was purchased by a free Black man and land investor, Henry C. Thompson, and it was named after James Weeks, another man who purchased land there and was part of the community there. And I one of the reasons I added Weeksville into the story is because um, it also was kind of a victim of gentrification after the building of the Brooklyn Bridge and more people moving into Brooklyn and highways being built through the community. It kind of fell apart. It was rediscovered in 1968 by a historian, James Hurley, and a pilot who was a local resident, who Hurley read about it, about the neighborhood in a book, and had not heard about it and was trying to research and find it. It could not find it. So they used an airplane to spot it from the sky. Um, Thank you for adding more information. If you look in the chat, more information is being added. Um, and so it was kind of like in the middle of this empty lot were these houses that were remnants of Weeksville that had just been there all along. And the center, eventually an education center was built around it, and it opened in 2014, and then continued to raise funds for preservation efforts. And this was like, for me, this was very interesting because I lived so close to this area when I lived in Brooklyn, and I had never heard of this place. I had never heard of this neighborhood, and for me, it was just another one of those aspects of thinking about how, when obviously there were people documenting this and trying to make sure that this place didn't disappear, and historical preservationists are to this day continuing to make sure that people know about it. But for me, it was just kind of emblematic of the idea of how Black history is often lost, even in a neighborhood that is currently still majority Black. Um, this kind of hidden history was just right there and then was rediscovered. So I was able to actually go. I don't live in the US right now, I live in France. So in 2019, when I went back, I was able to actually visit the site and see. I wasn't able to do a complete tour, but I was able to visit the site and see the things and learn more about actually experience the neighborhood. And it was important for me to add this aspect to the story because for me, it felt like one way of reflecting the cyclical historical nature of what happens to African American neighborhoods in the US. Um, and One of Us Knows, the setting is a fixture is called Kavanaugh Island, and it is located on Palapala Island, which is spelled incorrectly here, my bad. And in real life, Bannerman's arsenal, it's called Bannerman's Castle because it looks like a castle, uh, is the ruins of that are still there. And Bannerman's Island, it's in the Hudson River, it's near Fishkill, and you can currently go there for tours. They have events there. It was built by a Scottish businessman who also was from Brooklyn. He lived in Brooklyn for most of his life. He sold military surplus, and after a while, it became too dangerous to keep it in Brooklyn. So he bought this island, decided to build a castle, not very well, and to store the surplus there. And he wanted also to make a museum and all of these things, but he passed away. Multiple, not multiple, several fires kind of aided in the destruction of the arsenal, the partial destruction, and eventually the island was closed to the public. So it was there, people could go there by kayak or um, but it was not really a safe place to go. And after many years, a trust was formed to begin conservation efforts, and it was reopened to the public in 1993. And for me, this was just like, first of all, I saw this place years and years and years ago, and I always thought this would be a great place to set a story, but I didn't have any story to set there until about 12 years later after first seeing it. And for this in contrast to Weeksville, or similar to Weeksville, was kind of a ruin that was in plain sight, that was not well maintained, and eventually through conservation efforts was made safe enough to be open to the public and to be able to maintain the structure and prevent further damage from happening. And for me, historically, this symbolized so much in the context of the book, which was kind of contrasting both Gilded Age moral panics as well as post 1917 influenza world, or not post 97, during the 1917 influenza pandemic, and then contrasting that to someone going through the COVID pandemic, and then um, the main character trying to be a historical preservationist and then ending up with this caretaker job because she was unable to get her degree in historical preservation, but if you're lucky enough to become a caretaker of a historical home, you can still be adjacent to that. Um, so yeah, for all of these elements, for both books, I really wanted to find elements that anchored the story, the setting of the story. Because for me, when I'm writing, I particularly like to have like the setting be kind of a background character as well. And for me, when I'm adding historical elements, it's super fun to find like real historical places and sometimes even real people, and kind of have a fictionalized version of what might have happened or what if someone else had bought Falapel Island, and kind of think of things like that because I don't know what Bannerman was into, but hopefully he was not into any of the things that people in One of Us Knows are, if you've read the book. Um, but yeah, so I think that I could keep rambling on, but I do think that it will be good to end here and dig into some questions with Kennedy and dig more deeply into the books and what went into writing them and why.
Hi. Hi everyone, I'm Kennedy Whiters and preservation architect here in Queens, New York. And I am so thrilled to be joining Alyssa Cole. Great meeting you during the prep for today's author talk. And thank you so much for Katie Peace, Preservation League of New York State, for reaching out to me to moderate. I was really pleased and surprised and thankful to receive her email last year. And then to be willing to co-host this event with Black Historic Preservation, even better. I do have a few questions, but I'd love for folks to populate the Q&A with their questions as well. I have a few, I have like 10, but I will whittle down to like 4. So, um, so my first two questions relate to the research and work I do on grammar and language and how we tell narratives, and that's under the umbrella of unredacted facts. And so it's more like reparative narratives in healing, in transforming our history, our the trauma that we've experienced as Black people into tools for narrative therapy. And so my first question is relating to that. And it's inspired by a question that comes from Twitter. I still call it Twitter. Twitter thread by Professor Rebecca Hall. And she's an independent scholar and author of a book called Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts. And so in her original post, she said, I'm quoting her from her thread, I'm doing a deep dive into how folks use story as a way to escape from trauma, how getting lost in speculative fiction is a kind of dissociative resilience, escaping into story. And she posed the question to the broad audience, has anyone written about that, the psychology of story? Then there is an emerging narrative therapy modality in clinical psychology and talk of story and imagination as resilience factors. Has anyone combined these frameworks? And so I'm curious to Alyssa, do you find it therapeutic to write historical fiction? Is it a sort of narrative therapy for yourself? And like we talked about the word catharsis as well. So
Yeah, this is such a great question. And I do see it as uh, I hadn't thought of it as narrative therapy, but I do think in a way it is. Um, for me, it was so basically, I've always been writing since I was a kid. And I also was an editor for a while, like at a science journal, not at fiction. But as a kid, I would, for example, if I was reading a short story or something in a magazine or something. And then at a certain point, I got tired of the characters always being white because I was like, this does not make sense to me because most of the people around me are not white. So I don't understand why, I was reading so much and I was like, why is like everyone white in these books? This doesn't seem realistic. So at a certain point, I started like editing the stories that I was reading and I would like get white out and change the descriptions of people
wow.
so they would have brown eyes and brown skin instead of blue eyes and like pale skin. And for me, then eventually, I in the stories I was writing myself, the characters were always Black or from different brown backgrounds, and white as well, because like for me, it was more reflecting my reality. But also, I do think that there is an element of, for me, it's like reflecting reality, but also kind of like reparative of seeing like, okay, there's this kind of huge thing that's wrong. I mean, and this is not to take anything away from like books that I've loved, that I don't think every book has to, have a Benetton, be a Benetton, but you know what I'm saying. In the general representation of the world, there has been a clear decision made not to represent so many different kinds of people um in stories or in movies or on TV shows. It's seen as the with the thing being given, oh, it's not marketable or whatever, but that's not the actual reason. But so for me, when I was started writing historicals, it was actually after starting to read Ta-Nehisi Coates's blog, and where he talked a lot about history amongst he talked about a lot of things. But for me, I really love the history post. So I started reading more about Black history. And then for me, it became kind of imperative for me to incorporate that into the stories that I was writing, as a way of making sure that I was helping to add to the stories that were out there that were kind of changing the idea of what was going on in the past. So in that way, it's kind of like a kind of therapy, or a kind of trying to, I don't know, for me, because I was an editor, I think of it in a way as like editing the way that literature was seen, and because I was in romance, which was particularly not into publishing anything but, you know, cishet white couples, which is changing now. But for me, it was like really important to um, show different aspects. And then because I was writing a lot of historical stories and doing all of the research that went into that, that was actually very like traumatizing because, you know, even if all of those things didn't go into the book, I had to learn about them and kind of like sit with them and decide how I was going to represent that, even if it wasn't on the page. What the character's world was like would influence how they move through the story. And at a certain point, the last historical fiction novel that I wrote, like during the first Trump presidency, which is probably related, but I have a historical series called The Loyal League, which is about Black spies during the Confederate, during the Civil War, and they're spying to help the Union. It's based on a real group. And in the last book, the hero, who was a free man who was kidnapped into slavery and then like was freed and is now working as a spy. It's basically him going to assassinate Jefferson Davis, which at the end of the book, that could not happen because they couldn't change the actual history. So kind of, I feel like all of these like traumatic things I read and all of the frustration I felt while I was like doing all of that research over the years, then when no one is watching is the catharsis of all of that. So it was like set in the modern day. It touches on all of the historical stuff, but also I got to kind of have more free reign with how I could end that book. And so yeah, I do think that these kinds of stories, that story and particularly stories that like delve into history and Black history and history of marginalized people, can really, even if it's a thriller or a romance, and there are all these other elements that are entertaining and exciting and fun for the reader, they can also be very cathartic.
Yeah, thank you for that reflection. And it ties into what I heard you say in your talk earlier about cataloging Black experience, and that's reparative as well, because it's repairing the archive, and we need so much of that. It's through um, covert and overt or indirect omission and erasure of our history, literal burning of books that have documented our history, and just people, because they're so traumatized, Black people not not wanting to talk about slavery, for example. And I have a book called My
Yeah.
Folks Don't Want Me to Talk About Slavery. So the work we're doing today and moving forward is so instrumental um, in its archival work that's a part of the repair that we need to. One more question about language, and then I see a question in the Q&A that ties into a question I have as well. So my question is about language and words and the intention behind like word choices in both books. But for this one, it's for when no one is watching. And it's on page 346. I see the word survivor. And so you say, in quotes, you know, Candace, Fitzroy says, as if he's about to launch into one of his old man stories. Candace's great grandmother grew up in Weeksville. She was one of the survivors. And so I'm curious about the decision to use the word survivor here. And it's a nice way, seems like a new way to reframe our experience, Black people's experience in the pressures that we experience on our existence, and gentrification is a force that's been a pressure on us, and it's just this continuum of forces from enslavement, lynching, redlining, et cetera, that just continual push on us. And yes, in part, like our white-led government and just this conspiring of then white citizens and et cetera, just forcing white fear, et cetera. And so to view us as survivors of this this tug of war, and even often sometimes even can phrase it as an internal civil war too. So yeah, I'm just curious about the word choice of survivor here.
Yeah, so for that, so if someone hasn't read When No One Is Watching, like gentrification itself, as embodied by a corporation, is the antagonist. And for me, and I will just add that something that was interesting to me, like as I was writing it, there were a lot of things that I was like, people are going to say this is over the top. People are going to say this is not like believable. It's fiction, but I get that a lot. It's not believable. Like some of the things that I was writing that were based on actual historical things, even if they were heightened in the story, but were based on real things. And I will just say that that book did come out after the summer of 2020. And it was like very interesting for me having it come out in that time period where people were really examining the ways that Black communities have been historically treated and continue to be treated in the US. And one of the things for me was just seeing the things that were happening in the news, and just were things that were mirroring the things that happened in the story, which I think I obviously was not happy about because I feel like this is the worst PR campaign ever. I really do not want any of these things really happening in real life, but they were in the book because they happen in real life. But so the use of the word survivor, like I do think that a lot of what people experience is a kind of warfare in a way. And saying that, it seems like, oh, it's exaggerating, or but like when you think about the level of trauma that has happened overall to communities and to the individuals in those communities, people who have lost everything, or after like scraping together to build things up, or sometimes another aspect that I think of is like even people who were prevented from ever having anything. And like a lot of like personal experience went into it, like from my family and stuff like that. But like one thing I think of is so my family lived in Jersey City for most of my life. And they don't live there anymore. They had to move because, gentrification, and the property taxes went up too high, and it was to a ridiculous amount. That means only rich people can live there because only rich people, very rich people, can pay this level of property taxes. But I often think of a story that my mom told me of like when they were looking for a house, the realtor kept showing them houses like near the housing projects, and every house that she wanted to buy, and like no one even really wanted to live in Jersey City at that point when we moved there, but the realtors were still trying to steer them away from houses that eventually would have value. And like luckily she met a really nice realtor who was like not going along with that, and he was like, no, this is the house she wants, we're just gonna let her buy this house. But like there was, and she told me this story because we were walking past a house that was on sale for like a lot of money, and she was like, this is one of the houses that I tried to buy, and they were like, well, they kept coming up with reasons why. So like there are all these insidious things, and these things that are minor, like a realtor saying, oh, why don't you look at this house instead? And then that lead up to like that combined with everything else, like redlining, like literal redlining, and police presence in certain neighborhoods, and the way people act if people move to certain neighborhoods, and then you have the legal aspect and all the forces that combine to kind of just traumatize people. And even if it's not something, not trauma in the sense that we usually think about it, like I don't think most people are like, oh, I'm traumatized by the fact that someone wouldn't sell me a house. But on some level, even if they don't feel that it is, it is. And it kind of compounds, and it compounds through generations because, you know, those people who weren't allowed to buy those houses then weren't allowed to pass that on to their children. And, you know, and that we go have that going back to throughout the entire history of America. So for the use of the word survivor, it's like in the sense of the heightened situation in the book, but also the real sense, the real aspect of the lived experiences of Black Americans.
Thank you. Yeah, and with that language, like it's reclaiming the narrative as a Black person, like framing our experience in a way that makes more sense and resonates with our lived embodied experience. And again, I just really appreciate your work and your offering in doing that. Okay, so
Thank
we
you.
have a question, yeah, from Andy Richardson. Says, hi from Richmond, Virginia. I'm the general manager of Fountain Bookstore here, and your thrillers are some of the best sellers in the genre. Oh, okay.
Great.
Woo, woo. Can you talk about your research into, he says DID, I'm assuming that's acronym for dissociative identity disorder, for One
Yes.
of Us Knows. Um, I love, I love that. He said, I love that, or they love that element of the story. And I also want to know the reason for pairing DID with the historic preservation professional, if there is a reason behind that.
Um, First of all, thank you for selling my books and thank you for letting me know and thank you for the question. Um, so my research into DID, so I chose that for the character to have DID because I thought it would be um, really interesting in this to use it in the thriller, but not in the usual way, which is like something is going on, and then at the end, the character realizes that they have DID, and one of their alters is like the bad guy and doing bad things. And I wanted this book to be about the person who, in another thriller, would be the character that comes out at the end. It was like, yeah, it was me doing all the bad stuff. So they're like the bad, you know, bad in the sense of how they're generally portrayed in media. I wanted them to be the hero or the anti-hero. And so I did a lot of research. And basically, I read tons of books, both by psychiatrists and people who worked in the field and from systems themselves. I read tons of forums and um, blogs, and I hired an accuracy consultant, um, that is a DID system, a Callie Smith, and just read so much stuff. And for me, I already kind of had this because, you know, there are people who say like, oh, it's not real, or I don't think it's a real thing. And so one of my interests in it was the idea of an internal world. And I think that's the thing that makes it seem fake to a lot of people, or like, and it's for me because I'm trying to keep this as short as possible. But I already was thinking about the idea of internal world in a different sense, in the sense of dreams, because there are some people, like, for example, I often have periods where I dream I will be in one place when I dream, or like one neighborhood or one house or something for certain periods of time. And so I used to ask people, oh, do you have like dream places? And some people will be like, what are you talking about? Like this, I have no idea what you're talking about. And other people will be like, oh, yeah, yeah, there's this house that I've been dreaming about for like 10 years, or like, oh, yeah, there's this apartment, or like there's this neighborhood. So I was thinking from that, I had been thinking about that for a long time. And then when I was researching DID and the idea of internal worlds, and I was like, if our brains can do this in dreams, why wouldn't they be able to do them for other people in different aspects? And then the different elements and parts. And for me, the important thing was to make sure that nothing I wrote was harmful to anyone with DID if they read it. So that was the main reason I got the consultant, and luckily there was nothing there because I tried to stay away from like um, going too far into the trauma of what caused the system to be formed. But for me, it was just fascinating because like our brains are capable of so much, and for me, basically, anytime I thought of okay, the of an idea for the story that I wanted to happen for the system and the story, Bad Day System, um, when I researched, it was something that was possible. And so I tried not to do too much, but I also just found it to be a great for me writing. It was very hard. It was very hard because every time I changed, because there are multiple characters, every time I changed like an element of a character, an element of what they know or something, then that like would ripple through the story, and then I would have to go and change everything for every other character. But the research, this book took me a very long time to write. It took me much longer than it normally takes me to write a book. But in the end, I was glad. I've heard from several multiplicity systems asking me if I do have DID because they wanted to know how it was so accurate. And I was like, I don't, but or I don't think I do. If I do, I don't know. But for me, I just try to focus on the aspects that overlap with what I do know. And this is what I do with every story where I'm writing a character who is different from me in some way. I try to think about like what elements of myself um, can maybe be analogous or similar to whatever is going on with that character or whatever difference there is, and then trying to build on that instead of trying to like just make things up, or so trying to lean into the elements of commonality, even if it's not at all in this. It's hard to explain outside of my head, but basically doing all the research and then finding the things that I feel like I can understand and portray accurately without having that lived experience myself.
And any insights into like the
Oh,
preservation
yes,
fictional?
yes.
I just curious, get to be personal.
No,
Is there anything I can learn about myself with DID pairing or yeah.
um, for that, it wasn't entirely intentional, but as I was going along, the idea of someone who like loves history and um particularly like older buildings and like not understanding this aspect of themselves and also having this whole history of themselves of their past that they don't know and so much they don't know about themselves. I thought that was like an interesting contrast of like really kind of having a deep desire to know more about history but also not knowing so much about their own history.
Interesting. Food for thought, yeah. Okay, we have another question in the chat. And it says, I loved hearing you speak at the Ripped Bodice last year. How did you choose the locations for these books, like Bannerman Castle versus other New York State area islands?
Banner and Castle, it's because, like I said earlier, I saw it, I did like see it from the train and say like, what is that? And I just love this idea of like this random castle just on the water, like completely randomly something that you would not expect to see there. And I thought it would be a great setting. And I also was really interested in like historical islands with like where like rich people had just built their homes, and it's like some it felt like to me something always went wrong, like there was always a fire. If someone built it for their wife, then their wife always like immediately like passed away as soon as the house was being finished, or so I just like really love this idea for a setting for a story, and then particularly for the story I wanted to tell with a bad day system, then that all came together. Um, but I did like try and draw elements from lots of different islands and different like, rich people homes. Like I visited the Vanderbilt mansion in Asheville years ago and it was just like, this is so bizarre to me. But, like this level of like wealth and just like walking around and and I forget what it's called, the in California in St. Louis Obispo, but like just the idea of like these like grand historical homes and like that people lived in and built for like specific reasons, and then like because it's a thriller, what are the creepy what's the dark underbelly that could be behind the building of these houses.
Related, we have a potential pitch for another book idea. Ever considered writing about folks that work in historic cemeteries?
Ew.
Mm.
I'm writing that in my little historic
Yeah,
cemeteries.
thank you to
Who was that from?
anonymous attendee. Maybe they will identify themselves, or maybe not. Asking for a friend, Neela.
Okay. If
Thank
I
you.
ever do, Neela, you will be in the acknowledgements.
Oh, she worked. Oh, Greenwood. Oh, yeah. Shout out to
Oh my
Greenwood.
God, Greenwood.
Oh, yeah.
I
Right.
have a good Greenwood story. That is where my husband proposed to me at Greenwood.
Oh my gosh. What a lovely
And it
story.
was we were going around like doing the self-guided tour, and then like he proposed, and it was like for me it was kind of like a circle of life moment because there were like people there mourning, and then like which I didn't really know at the time when we went there. I didn't realize it was like still in use. But yeah, I love Greenwood Cemetery.
He was a womb to tomb. Oh, I got jokes. Okay. Um, all right, we have about 4 minutes left. If there are any more questions or comments, Katie would like to join us back in the speakers lounge.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Neela, for for adding that to the conversation. And Alyssa, if you ever do write a story featuring historic cemeteries, call us. We can do this again.
Oh, Woodlawn Cemetery is represented
Yes.
too. Woodlawn.
Nice. Nice. Um, yeah, so if anyone has any last minute questions, please drop them. Kennedy, do you have anything else that you want to touch on before we wrap it up? Or Alyssa, if there's anything else that you'd like to share with this particular audience about you kind of diving into the world of historic preservation in your books?
I will just say, like I mentioned earlier, the all of the research and information that is shared by people who work in historical preservation um, does help writers like me when we're writing our books, even if they're not directly related to historical preservation. So I do think that that the work, even if you're not aware of it, it is kind of, in addition to helping the people who visit these sites and who or who are researching these sites for academic reasons, just be aware that there are writers who are reading your stuff who have no idea what, an 18th century mansion would look like, or what went into building a brownstone, or what was the reason for, secret room here or there. And so just for you all to think to, if you haven't thought about it, you are actually like contributing in other ways to sharing history with people by providing writers with the information they need to be able to write their books and write about things that then readers will be interested in. And then maybe that's in a different circle, like the historical preservationist, uh, to writer, to reader, to visiting the historical site circle.
I love that. And that, yeah, that I think everyone can take that and like take heart from it. Like, oh, yes, sometimes it does feel like screaming into the
Yes.
void a little bit. So it's nice, it's nice to know that, people are seeing it and responding to it. Um, Well, thank you both so much. Thank you, Alyssa, for writing the books, for taking the time to share them with us. Thank you, Kennedy, for agreeing to co-host this and moderate the conversation. This was
Thank
really
you.
lovely. We do have a bunch of author talks coming up on our calendar after this one, so thank you all for tuning in. I hope you can join us for another one. Our next one is actually next week. We're going to be joined by two of the authors of this book, Spiritualism's Place, all about Lilydale out in Western New York, a spiritualist community that is still very much in existence. So I hope you can join us for that. If not, then for another book talk or another event sometime in the future. But keep in touch and we hope to see you soon. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you, Kennedy.
Thank you, everyone.